12-year-old girl was selling cookies to fund her chemotherapy when Clint Eastwood approached and did something no one saw coming. The open-air market in San Diego buzzed with life, the aroma of charred corn, cinnamon-glazed nuts, and freshly baked sourdough bread wafting through the air, mixing with the salty ocean breeze. Stalls lined the walkway, each bursting with vibrant color-woven baskets, jars of amber honey, trays of ripe fruit. Vendors called out to passers-by, their voices blending with the distant strumming of a street musician's guitar. Amid it all stood a modest folding table, devoid of flashy banners or bright decorations, just a simple white sign with neat, delicate handwriting. Homemade cookies raising money for my chemo? Behind the table sat 12-year-old Madison, her small frame upright, but the shadows under her eyes told a heavier story. The heat bore down on her, beads of sweat forming at her temples, but she didn't complain. She couldn't, not when so much was at stake. Her cookies were wrapped in clear plastic, each tied with a thin Rabona labor of love. She'd spent the previous evening baking them with her mother, rolling dough with unsteady hands, pushing through the fatigue that never fully lifted. She'd taken breaks, resting her head on the cool kitchen counter as the oven timer counted down, but she refused to give up. Now she sat patiently, watching as people passed by. Some paused, read her sign, offered a polite smile, and moved on. Others didn't even glance her way. Madison didn't blame them. The market was alive with distractions, vendors vying for attention. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat stopped, reaching into her purse. "I'll take a bag, sweetheart." Madison forced a smile, her fingers fumbling as she handed over the package. The woman slipped a $5 bill into the cash box. "Hope you get better soon, honey." Madison nodded, not mentioning that hope wouldn't cover the cost of her next treatment. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows, Madison's earlier optimism faded. She'd barely made enough for a single dose of medication. She took a deep breath, blinking against the exhaustion tugging at her. She'd known today wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to feel this heavy. Madison shifted in her chair, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness. The heat pressed against her skin, relentless and unyielding. She glanced at the cash box still, barely $20. Her mother had tried to dissuade her. "You don't have to do this, Maddie. I'll figure it out." But Madison had seen the bills piling up, the way her mother's hand shook as she opened them, the late-night sighs as she searched for solutions. Baking cookies had been their tradition, a slice of normalcy before the hospital visits, the needles, the pills. It was the last piece of their old life, and Madison clung to it. Now, as people passed her by, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. A little boy tugged at his father's hand, pointing to the cookies, but the man shook his head, distracted by his phone. A teenage girl lingered briefly before moving on, her arms full of bags from other stalls. Madison didn't blame them. They didn't know her. They didn't owe her anything. But as the hours slipped by, frustration built in her chest. She clenched her fists under the table, her body aching, the fatigue settling deeper. She'd spent so much time fighting her illness, and now she was fighting to matter. A woman stopped, her eyes flicking between Madison and the sign. "Where are your parents?" Madison froze. "I'm here by myself." The woman frowned. "Maybe someone should be helping you. You shouldn't have to be out here." Then she walked away. Madison stared at the ground, her jaw tightening. She knew she shouldn't have to be here, but what choice did she have? Just as she was about to pack up, she felt it a shift in the air, a ripple through the market. People were turning, murmuring, their attention drawn to something behind her. Madison turned slightly, and there he was. At first he looked like any other shopper, a tall man in a dark button-down and jeans. But there was something about him, a presence, that made people stop mid-step. Madison blinked, her mind catching up. Even with his aged face, the deep-set eyes and strong jaw were unmistakable. Clint Eastwood. The crowd reacted in hushed awe, some whispering his name, others frozen in place. Madison had never seen anything like it. Her mother had always talked about him, about the grit and presence he carried. Now, standing before her, he felt larger than life. He stopped at her table, his gaze shifting over the cookies, the cash box, the sign. Madison held her breath. Then he reached into his pocket. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Madison's heart pounded. Clint pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Madison's fingers trembled as she reached for a bag of cookies. "Sir," she whispered, "it's $5 a bag." Clint glanced up, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "I know," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He placed the entire stack into her cash box. The world seemed to stop. I can't take this," Madison stammered. "It's too much." But Clint didn't take it back. Instead, he reached for a cookie, broke off a piece, and tasted it. "You made these yourself?" he asked. Madison nodded. "Yes, sir." He chewed slowly, then nodded. "Good cookie." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Kid, you're tougher than most people I've met." Madison's throat tightened. The exhaustion, the worry, the frustration, it all crashed over her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. But the moment wasn't over. The crowd erupted, people stepping forward to buy cookies, dropping 20s, 50s, even more hundreds into the box. The woman who had walked away earlier returned, pressing a $50 bill into Madison's hands. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she said softly. Tears burned at Madison's eyes as she watched the line form, strangers rallying behind her. She had come here hoping to make a small difference, but she left knowing she'd been given something far greater: hope. In a world that often feels cold and indifferent, moments like these remind us of the power of kindness. One act of generosity can start a ripple effect, changing lives in ways we never imagined. So the next time you see someone fighting their battle alone, ask yourself, what can I do? How can I help? Because sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to turn someone's world around. Madison sat there, her hands resting on the table, trying to absorb what had just happened. The cash box, once nearly empty, was now overflowing with bills, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her mind raced, struggling to process the generosity, the kindness, the sheer disbelief of it all. The crowd began to thin as the market wound down, vendors packing up their stalls, families heading home with their purchases. But Madison remained, her heart still pounding, her thoughts a whirlwind of gratitude and wonder. She thought of her mother, of the late nights spent worrying over bills, of the quiet strength her mom had shown through every hospital visit, every treatment, every setback. This money wasn't just a lifeline for Madison. It was a gift to her mother, too. A chance to ease the burden, even if just a little. As she began to pack up her table, a man approached one of the vendors from across the way. He carried a small box in his hands, filled with fresh fruit and a loaf of bread. "Here," he said, placing it gently on her table. "For you and your mom. No charge." Madison looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Another vendor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, handed her a jar of honey. "This is from my bees," she said with a smile. "It's good for strength. You take care of yourself, dear." Madison nodded, her throat too tight to speak. By the time she finished packing, her table was surrounded not just by gifts, but by the warmth of a community that had come together in a single, unforgettable moment. She loaded everything into her bag, the weight of it a reminder of the day's unexpected turn. As she walked home, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows, Madison felt something she hadn't felt in months, a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for her mother, for the future, for the kindness of strangers. When she arrived home, her mother was in the kitchen, her face etched with worry. "Mattie," she said, her voice soft but strained, "how did it go?" Madison didn't answer right away. Instead, she set her bag on the table and pulled out the cash box, its lid barely closing over the stack of bills inside. Her mother's eyes widened as she opened it, her hands trembling as she sifted through the money. "Madison," she breathed. Where did all this come from? Madison smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Clint Eastwood happened, she said, her voice breaking. And then she told her mother everything. The market, the crowd, the moment when one act of kindness changed everything. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, her own tears falling freely. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. You're so strong, Maddie. So strong. That night, as they sat together at the kitchen table, counting the money and planning how to use it, Madison felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months.